Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright, so this will be the final video for the card draw series. This one will kind of summarize everything that's happened up until this point. So this is just a quick compilation or kind of cliff notes, if you will. So I don't want to take too much time on any single subject, and I even kind of want to speed through the whole thing as altogether just to make this a short video that's easy to digest. We'll start with the first one, which is based on attack draw. The two that stand out as being playable in most decks are Keeper of Fables and Oran Frostfang. The key thing to notice with these creatures is that they will trigger even if you're attacking with other creatures. So you get your other creatures out, then you cast these, then you swing with the creatures that don't have summoning sickness, and then you're able to draw. So these ones are especially good if you're running several creatures, either several small things, tokens, whatever, but they will gain you a bunch of value that way. If you're just playing like a Voltron or a single big thing, these won't really do much for you. So you do want to have a reasonable quantity of creatures out. So these are also pretty good top decks, or just things that you want to be careful of your sequencing so that you get the other things out first. Or if you want spells that will help draw you, Hunter's Insight and Hunter's Prowess are both very good choices here. The Hunter's Insight is good because it's an instant, so you can choose to declare, you can choose your target after blockers have been declared, so you just choose whatever gets through. And Hunter's Prowess is good because it gives them a buff and trample, so you can just put it on your big guy and it doesn't matter. I mean, your opponent will most likely want to block that thing. They'll be extra incentivized, but it won't necessarily matter if your thing is big enough to just hit for a bunch of damage anyway. Or even if you just tack this onto like a little 2/2 and attack somebody who doesn't have any blockers, it can draw you 5 cards, just a little 2/2. So it does have the disadvantage of being a sorcery. You have to do it well before they declare their blockers, but either way, the buff and the trample will both help that out. The next category is ETB Draw. There's obviously a lot of little creatures that will draw you like 1 card, and there's like a card that'll draw you up to 3, Voice of Many, depending on what your opponents have. But those are things that you would want to play on an ETB Blink Flicker type deck. 2 of them, though, however, stand out as being viable for just about any deck type. That'd be Regal Force and Pygmy Cavu. Regal Force draws you a card for each green creature you control, so it's important to know that if you have any colorless cards like artifacts, or if you somehow created tokens that are of a different color, this won't apply to that, but it will count any green tokens that you have. This is a staple that you'll see in a lot of decks, and for good reason. Pygmy Cavu, on the other hand, sees almost no play, and it works in kind of a reverse way to Regal Force. Regal Force is your board, so you have direct control over it. Pygmy Cavu is based on what your opponents are doing. So I can see why you might be scared to play something that would potentially whiff, but in general, overall, this should get you at least a handful of cards, and it could very well draw you a lot of cards and perform very well. Next would be the cards that draw you based on the power of your creature. So there are several ones that will make you sacrifice the creature in order to draw cards. Those don't really make the highlight list here. The ones that do are Garruk Primal Hunter, Return of the Wildspeaker, Rishkar's Expertise, and Soul's Majesty. All these just want you to have at least 1 big creature. If your commander has power 5 or greater, or if your deck is playing a critical mass of big creatures, these are all either your primary or secondary card draw. These are very important to that deck, that type of deck, and you should run all of them. There's not much reason to run 1 or 2 of these, but not the others. Some of them are slightly more beneficial than others. The Return to the Wildspeaker does have another mode if you cared more about the combat trick side of that, which usually you would include this deck usually for the card draw effect. Rishkar's Expertise is better because it allows you to free cast something after you draw. Soul's Majesty is a mana cheaper. Garruk is a planeswalker, so he does have a plus and an ultimate in case you don't need the card draw at that time. But you would generally want to include all of these together as part of one package. The next category would be Swarm Draw. This one is based on the quantity of creatures that you have. Starting with Collective Unconscious, this one just says draw a card for each creature you have. Then there's Mouth to Feed. This one obviously has synergies with token decks. And if you happen to need to discard, either because an opponent wheeled or because you just have on a previous turn or the turn you're on, you've drawn so many cards that you need to discard right then, you can draw from the feed half of this is what draws you cards, so you cast that from your graveyard. So this is a great card to discard if you're ever forced to for whatever reason, because the card draw you'll still have. But it does require you to have medium or bigger creatures. If you're strictly playing just the tiniest little weenies, it won't go very well in that deck, but for the most part, it's a pretty strong card. It's way underrated. It should see a lot more play. I think that this card would overperform most people's expectations. It's good in a lot of ways. As a split card, both halves can be very powerful, but oftentimes you might just look at the token creating side as being pointless, but it's still very good. And then Regal Force, same thing as we mentioned before in the part about being an ETB effect. But he does care about the quantity of creatures, so I mentioned him again here. And then last is Shamanic Revelation, which is just a strictly better Collective Unconscious because it costs 1 less mana, and any creatures you have that have power 4 or greater are going to gain you life. That's not a reason to include Shamanic Revelation over Collective Unconscious. If you're playing one, you should play both. This should definitely be your card draw package if you're running a lot of little creatures, or if you just in general intend on having a lot of creatures in play. Even if they're big, whatever, just these are for large board states. Next would be the things that are cast or ETB draw, starting with all of the enchantresses. Argothian Enchantress, Eidolon of Blossoms, Enchantress's Presence, Setessan Champion, and Verduran Enchantress. These are all for enchantment-based decks. If you are playing an enchantment deck, this is your card draw package. You need all of them. You don't take some. You take all of them together. If you're not playing an enchantment deck, you have no reason to play them. This is strictly for an enchantment-based deck. And then next will be the creatures that draw you cards as you cast or creatures enter the battlefield. Starting with Beast Whisperer, this is the best one of the bunch. Not only is it the cheapest mana cost, but it's for every creature spell that you cast. He also has relevant creature types as an elf druid. He can very easily go in some of the most popular tribal decks in the color. But this one, because the creature doesn't need to resolve, even if it's countered, you still draw a card. Next, Garruk's Pack Leader cares about if the creature is power 3 or greater, when it enters the battlefield, you may draw a card. Now, the May ability is great if you need to slow down your card draw. The fact that it's power 3 or greater can work against you in some decks, but it does affect when it enters. So if you're playing flickers and blinks and stuff like that, or if you have creature token generating effects such as Primeval Bounty or Rampaging Baloths, if you're generating tokens that way that are kind of big and can also trigger this, you get the extra benefit from those. Next is Primordial Sage. Cast a creature, draw a card. Again, this one is a May ability, and that can be beneficial at times. It's also cast, so even if it's countered, you draw it, but it doesn't have the synergies with Blink and Flicker type decks. Soul of the Harvest, on the other hand, does, because it happens whenever a non-token enters the battlefield, you may draw a card. This one doesn't work with the tokens that Garruk's Pack Leader would, but it doesn't have the restriction of needing to be power 3 or greater. There are certain scenarios where one of these cards, because of the various stipulations, will be better than the others or may not be appropriate to the deck that you're playing. But in general, all 4 of these are pretty well equal and kind of go together. If you're playing one, you should kind of consider all of them as part of your card draw package. And next are the non-creatures that draw you cards as you cast or creatures enter the battlefield. Elemental Bond cares if they're power 3 or greater. So again, this one synergizes with tokens such as the Primeval Bounty. Next is Guardian Project that cares about creatures entering the battlefield, which also synergizes with Blink and Flicker type decks. Great Henge, which just says non-token, and you also put a counter on it. Vanquisher's Banner requires the deck to be a tribal deck. If you're playing tribal, this should be included. If not, it should be excluded. And then finally, Zendikar Resurgent, which happens on cast, so you draw even if it's countered, and it doubles as a mana doubler, which is very important, and that's why it's one of the best cards in green. Now, while you should probably consider playing, multiples of these cards if you can, in order, I would say Guardian Project should be the first card that you include as card draw. Second would be Zendikar Resurgent because of the mana ability. The third one would either be Vanquisher's Banner if it's tribal, or probably Elemental Bond if it's not. Great Henge is a great card, however, it is the one that is most ripe for misplays. So often I've seen players where they don't have enough mana to cast it yet, so what they end up doing is casting small creatures just because that's what they have and that's the kind of utility that they're trying to gain right then. The correct play, if possible, would be to cast the biggest creature you can, or the biggest power creature, then the following turn cast this, and then if you have mana left over, cast those small creatures, or wait another turn to cast those small creatures. But players unloading all their small creatures before it's out is exactly the wrong way to play it. Because this card is very susceptible to bad play, I think it's overrated, and it is exactly the kind of thing that encourages play mistakes. It's important to have any of these cards on the battlefield before you cast your creatures, and because of the Great Henge's high mana cost, which is reduced based on the power of the greatest creature you have, it is the one that is the most easy to screw up. The next category would be things that just draw you cards each turn, just statically. The two cards that I can think of that are playable in this are Sylvan Library and the Immortal Sun. Sylvan Library is one that is very good in CEDH, also if you have a life gain deck. Otherwise, it's highly overrated. It's not going to do you much good over the course of a game if you're not paying the life for it, and if you are, it's still kind of medium. Now, the best scenario for Sylvan Library is if you start the game with like 2 lands and Sylvan Library in hand, because in that case, you have 5 chances to get a land. Your first turn draw, your second turn draw, and then on turn 3 when you draw 3 cards. So it does help you in that regard, but as the game goes on, especially if you're not using its effect to draw extra cards, if you're looking at 3 and taking 1, that's not a high benefit. Great in CEDH, but in a casual game, it is not going to perform nearly as well as any of the other cards on this list, and it is highly overrated. Do not consider this a must-run. The Immortal Sun, on the other hand, it's very good. The card draw is not necessarily what makes it so good. That is something that as you get to the middle to late game and you're kind of running low on cards, this is a great card to get out because you can look forward to your next turn of drawing 2 cards and maybe start getting back on track. The fact that it gives your creatures +1/+1 is great if you got a large quantity of creatures. The ability to stop planeswalkers in some cases can be game winning or game ending for one opponent. But it's the fact that it also makes your spells cost 1 less. So it has card draw, and that's why it's on this list, but it's the other things, particularly the discount, that makes it so powerful and so applicable to most decks. Next would be things that draw you on when they die. These are die trigger draws. First is Fecundity. This one probably doesn't see much play relative to what it should. This one can be used one of 2 ways. Either if you have sack outlets and you plan on making your own creatures die, or if you're afraid of your opponent's board wiping. If you put 15 creatures out and you're worried that your opponents are going to board wipe, as they should, then play this card and say, go ahead, board wipe, I'll draw 15 cards. It can be good if your opponents are also forcing you to sacrifice, like a Dictate of Erebos effect, but if that's in play, then it means that your opponent who's in black is probably not only sacrificing things to make you sacrifice things, but are sacrificing for other benefits. And this is a symmetrical effect, meaning they will draw cards too. So they'll have the benefits of the creature dying and drawing cards. So it does have a little bit of potential to backfire, but for the most part, you should be able to get better use out of it than even that opponent. And that opponent, the black deck with sacrifice, dictative, Erebos type effects, is the opponent that is most likely to make the best use out of this. So even in that case, if you're applying things right, you will benefit off this. Next is Skull Clamp. It's one of the most common cards in all of Commander. I don't think I need to explain how it works, but it's a very good card if that's what you want to do. But you do have to make sure that you have small creatures, tokens, non-tokens. If all you're doing are playing big boys, then it doesn't really do much. Next would be these ones are kind of situational. They're very conditional, is what I categorize it as. First on the list would be Compost. This is whenever a black card is put into one of your opponent's graveyards, you may draw a card. Now, obviously, because this depends on what your opponents are doing, that's one reason why it probably doesn't see as much play as it should, in that you are dependent on conditions outside of your control. You have no control over your opponent's deck. But most games will include at least one deck with black in its color identity. So if the card is an instant or sorcery, it will go into their graveyard and you will draw a card. If it's a creature, maybe either because it was killed from a board wipe or if they are intentionally sacking it, you will draw cards. So it does have the ability to really benefit you pretty greatly if you even have one opponent in black. For 2 mana, it's very cheap and you can get it out early. And if it's a dead card, it's a dead card. That'll happen sometimes. Next is Viridian Revel. This says whenever an artifact is put into an opponent's graveyard, draw a card. Obviously, if they're playing something like Derevi, where they're purposely sacrificing artifacts, you can get benefits that way. Or even if it's just kind of a normal game, if you're playing especially Artifact Hate and have like artifact board wipes, you can help make this card work while at the same time setting your opponents back. So it's a great combo in a deck like that. If you're trying to avoid playing artifacts and punish your opponents who are. But if you're not playing any kind of artifact hate, then you're dependent on someone else doing an artifact-based board wipe. So it can still do you some good, but it may just sit there. Next is Heartwood Storyteller. This one says whenever a player plays a non-creature spell, each of their opponents draws a card. You would only want this card in a deck that is almost all creatures. If you have more than 10 non-creature spells, don't play this card, ever. How it works best is if one of your opponents maybe plays, like opponent A plays a creature and a non-creature. Well, you and the other 2 opponents will draw a card. Opponent B plays 2 non-creatures. So you, opponent A, and opponent C will each draw 2 cards. Opponent C plays 1 non-creature. So you, A, and B all draw 1 card. Then you play 3 creatures. None of your opponents draw cards. It is symmetrical, so it does mean your opponents will also draw cards, but you should draw the most cards off of it. And if you are playing a creature-heavy deck, you're probably playing spells that draw you cards every time you play a creature, so you might even draw a card when you play this creature. If you're not doing something that is incredibly creature-heavy, don't do it. Next is Recycle. This one is strictly a combo card. If you don't know how it works, or if you're not comfortable doing the combo that this requires, don't play it. Because it forces you to skip your draw phase, and it makes your max hand size 2. Now, if you played this, and then you played a Reliquary Tower, the Reliquary Tower should negate the max hand size part of it. However, you would still not draw during your draw step. So you got to play this on the turn that you intend to win, and it's got to be very combo heavy, and it's got to be something where you're just cantripping, and you just keep an engine going. One thing to point out is that it's whenever you play a card, draw a card, so it does apply to lands. So assuming that this is in your hand at the start of the turn, you'd want to play this, then play a land, draw off of the land, and then start getting your engine going. And then last for this side is Benefactor's Drought. It is an instant. It it can be used a couple different ways. The way I use it is in like a elf deck or mana dork type thing to untap my guys so that I got more mana. When I do that, I only draw the one card, and I don't necessarily care about the card draw aspect to it. But what you can do is when one of your opponents is attacking another one of your opponents because opponent B has their creatures tapped and so they're wide open to attack, what you can do is cast this, untap all creatures so that that person now has blockers. Their blockers presumably are big enough to kill some of the attacker's creatures, which is good for you, and you draw a card for each creature that does block, so it benefits you. It sets one opponent behind, it helps you, and the person who is now able to block when he thought he was going to be taking damage, he's probably happy too. So it's very good if you want to get tricky like that, or if you just want to use the ability to untap creatures to benefit whatever engine you might have going. That can also be good. Next is the sacrifice draw category. Now this is one where I don't really see a whole lot of good. The two best cards I could think of are Yavimaya Elder. That's a very common creature, a staple, which should not be a staple, I think, because it's basically 5 mana Harmonize. It costs 5 mana, although you can split it up over the course of 2 turns. You draw 3 total cards, but 2 of those have to be basic lands. That's not usually very good. You can, if you already have something in play that draws you a card as you cast creatures, such as the Guardian Project from before, you can draw a card when you cast him, and then you can hold them as a blocker if you don't need the card draw right away, so that you can prevent yourself from taking damage from a source, a non-trample source. But for the most part, he's way overplayed. He should not see as much play as he does. He's okay for utility, but if you're counting him in the card draw slot of your deck, no, he's not good enough to take the place of a card draw. And the other one is Cryptic Caves, where you can pay 1, tap it, sack it, draw a card. I think in any deck that really cares about lands like Gitrog, Korvold, Titania, those ones will want it. If you're doing anything like Muldrotha, where you can get it out of the graveyard, or if you have the Crucible of Worlds or the Ramunap Excavator, where you can get it out of the graveyard, that's all cool. But for the most part, I would rather have a basic land than this in most decks. You could throw it in just because it doesn't really cost you anything, but the benefit is very minimal because it'll only draw you 1 card. Again, you could throw it in because it's not really important. It's not going to affect your deck very much. But the one thing that I could say positive about this is that it's kind of better than a cycling land, because anything that cycles to draw you a card, those are lands that you have to discard them to get the land. This one you can at least play for a while and get the benefit of mana, and then when you feel you don't need it, you can sacrifice it and get a card off the top of your library. So I do think it's better than a cycling land. Other than that, not super good. And then the last category is the artifact draw. Now everything in this category could go in any deck of any color. If you're playing something that's artifact-centric, or if you're playing something that really cares about tapping, or if you are trying to avoid effects that your opponents may have that say you can only draw 1 card per turn, these are good in that you can do it on, draw a card on each person's turn besides your own, and that way you get the extra card draw that way and get around those effects that say you can only draw 1 card per turn. But there are 2 that I think are generally okay to go in any deck. That would be Endless Atlas, because it only costs 2 to cast and it costs 2 to draw a card. The requirement that you have 3 or more lands with the same name isn't a problem in a monocolor deck. It shouldn't be much of a problem in a 2-color deck. It's something that you could get out on turn 2 just to cast it, just so that you have less cards and you're using your mana. But if you are you keep a 2-land hand, you play this on turn 2, then turn 3 you still haven't drawn one yet. It's not going to do anything for you, and that's going to feel bad. But overall, it's not a bad value card. And then the other one, Tower of Fortunes, this one I really like and think should probably see more play because it draws you 4 cards whenever you activate it. And anything that can repeatedly draw you 4 cards is pretty good. The activation cost of 8 mana, so 2 mana per card, isn't like a bargain by any means, but if generating 8 mana is a problem for you, then you're probably doing things wrong. And I mean, obviously, sometimes you'll be mana screwed, or if you get this out just too early before you've ramped up to 8 mana, that's understandable. But for the most part, if you're looking at the cost and just saying it's too expensive, you can't make that work, then chances are you might want to look at other aspects of building your deck. So that was this final kind of summary video of all of the card draw effects that are available in Green. These are just the highlights. If you want to see more cards that fit into each of those 10 categories, then see the individual videos. But if you're just looking for kind of the best of the best, the things that you either absolutely should or perhaps should consider, this is basically going to be what you want as your card draw engine in any deck that includes Green. So that's it, and hopefully we'll get more content out to you soon. Thank you.